I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to this session, which is a book launch. Although the book basically was written got published in 2022 by Dr. Mujtaba Piracha. So before we start the conversation around the book, I thought I'd briefly introduce Dr. Mujtaba Piracha. Although he and I go back a long time, I've known him since he was a young man. So I won't share those stories. But since that point, basically, Mujtaba has had a distinguished and varied career. So he was our ambassador to WTO in Geneva. He's a civil servant. He's also served as the Commissioner Lahore and held positions in finance and planning in the Punjab government, and was also Secretary Industries. But more importantly, in the middle of his career, Mujtaba sort of completed his PhD. He'd done his undergrad degree from the London School of Economics, but he went back to the Institute of Development Studies in Sussex and completed his PhD. And this book that got published and that we're going to discuss today is basically his PhD thesis, which also got the book award from Bloomsbury, Pakistan in 2022. So it's a book called Property Taxes and State Incapacity in Pakistan. So, you know, I mean, there's a famous quote by Benjamin Franklin who said, or who's, you know, people say he said, that there's nothing certain in life except death and taxes. So Mujtaba's book is basically saying in Pakistan, everything is certain except taxes. And this is a kind of phenomenally important question. So what I want to do before I go to the specificities of the book is basically to sort of frame the problem that the book tries to deal with. And it's a bigger question that, you know, I mean, if you look at human history, basically before 300, 400 years ago, so we didn't have modern nation states. So now across the world, we have modern nation states in which you have citizenship relationships, you have constitutions, you have authority structures which are driven by bureaucracies and so on. At the root of the transformation to modern nation states was taxation. But taxation is a boring topic. People don't want to think about it or discuss it. But I just want to start this conversation, Mujtaba, by basically, you know, asking you to frame for the audience why the tax relationship is such a fundamental feature of modern nation states and citizenship across the world.
Thank you, Ali, and it's quite an honor to be here with you and this audience and talk about the book that eventually became a book, which you've been such a big part of from its inception. As you pointed out, I mean, taxes are something that we hear of or lack of in Pakistan. As Mete would say to me that now that we have achieved a growth rate in Pakistan of more than 3%, we need to start talking about some three-lettered word that ends with X. So, it's tax, right? So, where we are right now, and you hear in the newspapers, about to default, you know, where do we go get more money from? So what's been happening in Pakistan over time is something that we hopefully come back to and cover more later in this talk. But as Ali was pointing out, you see, there's a point of view, or there's a whole body of literature which links taxation with the building of modern state. People
who would pay taxes to the king or the state at that time, eventually started asking, what are you
for us in return, to put it very simply. And that led to some sort of representation in decision making and eventually to modern democracy and modern state. That's the Western experience. Taxes have, even in our context, led to better systems, at least to collect taxes. And that's for me as a bureaucrat a very interesting part of it. When we're reading KLE, Indian history and all that, in Pakistan you hear of KG Akbar के ज़माने में या उससे शेर शाह सूरी के वक्त तो जरीब इंट्रोड्यूस कराई, better measurement, ताकि taxes collection में
assessment के साथ ही होगी, predictability of taxes or extortion now. So kings realized, even though there was no representation, tax collection citizen state and produces it, whatever the land taxes. So we have to make sure that they are collected fairly, there's no extortion.
This led to at least a better functioning tax collection, I wouldn't say department at that time, but methods, right?
This was perhaps building of state capacity, which then got reflected as the states modernized into other perhaps working departments.
Also, but that's, you know, we'll leave it there. What basically I think taxes have the potential of doing, which we don't discuss very much, and I take it audiences like this, because I mean, taxes is a subject which can be potentially very numerical, very boring. So one of our challenges here today is to make it sexy enough for people to go home and talk about it to their children. But I don't know if that's going to happen, but we're going to give it a shot. The point is that taxes have an other function and historically have had a function other than revenue raising for the state to function. And that has been an element of demand for reciprocity from the citizenry who end up coughing up those taxes. So I leave it there for now, and we come back to this aspect.
So I think we can push the conversation a little bit further on this. I mean, since you went back to pre-democratic states, at that point, the major reason for collecting revenue was to support war. And, you know, sort of those kingdoms went into war because those were the decisions of the king. But the people who were actually paying for the war were people who were creating productive surpluses in society. So basically, it's coming back to war and taxes. So, but basically, as the states have evolved, the source for which taxes are used is also evolved. So on the expenditure side, basically, the demand for taxes is no longer driven by a need to support war, but it's driven by a bigger set of purposes. So how do you sort of see that evolving in Europe, and how do you see that evolving in societies like ours?
So I think there's, like I said, even pre-colonial India.
Some work had started on making tax collection easier and predictable and better. And obviously, even here, taxes were paying for wars and holding up, making big white elephant projects, which is still going on, by the way. But it kind of got disrupted, perhaps, in our context, by the British, who actually came in and took a contract to collect taxes initially, and became the state. So that's a very quick sort of ascendancy to whoever collects tax really is your master, and that you see also in big cities in Pakistan. Jo bhatta leta hai, he is the one who is the master of the city. So, you know, I think the natural progression, and I'm not a historian on tax, but the natural progression of this system of wars and taxes and violence and tax collection got kind of disrupted by this colonial sort of incursion into the subcontinent, which was, I think, overwhelming. And not that it stopped tax collection, but it brought the modernity that they'd already achieved by that time in Europe. Because what happened was that they started codifying tax. And you had, even now in the academy, we are taught something like the main tax at that time, by the way, was the land revenue. So they developed land settlement manual. Dewey's Land Settlement Manual, volume this big, was developed by the British based on land settlement practices of different parts of India. They brought in the big, I think, interesting point to make here would be that when they want, of course, they came here for extraction of surplus, right? So they wanted to create that surplus. So if not just wanting raw materials, but wanting revenue to run the empire. The empire was not being run by British taxpayers' money. The empire was being run by people who were producing here and sending surplus to the mother country. Now, what that drove was building of not only better institutions and land revenue departments and systems, this whole setup of what is now called the deputy commissioner was actually a collector of land revenue. And that is how the system started developing up. The magisterial powers of the land collector at that time were given to him to enable him to collect the taxes, right? The other interesting thing that happened was development of your ability to produce more and produce better. So what turned into a hydraulic society, all these systems of barrages and canals and exponential increase of cultivable land in what is now Punjab and Sindh was partly an outcome of not just requiring more raw materials, but giving people the factors of production so that they can produce more value, which can be taxed. That's at least how I look at it. And I see that, why I'm saying that, because I want to come back to it when we talk about, as an agriculturist, on how agriculture is neglected now in Pakistan and has been for a number of years. I would say partly because the government does not derive hardly any tax out of agriculture in Pakistan right now. So there's no, when the government or the state is not taxing you on something, then it has no interest in you producing more of that thing. That's also how I see it.
So, I mean, actually, that's kind of fascinating, and I'll just make one more point, and then we can shift away from the history to Pakistan-specific problem, which is that, you know, taxation in our part of the world is very integrally connected to the colonial relationship. I mean, I'm just putting together what you're saying, and therefore, the main impetus of the colonial structure was to extract resources to finance the wars of the empire, in some sense. So it became an extractive mechanism. And at the same time, to collect those taxes, the British set up a collectorate in which they gave two powers: the powers to take revenue and the powers to impose order. So the order was very much tied to the revenue. So it's a impository system in some sense. Whereas if you look at the transformation in Europe that was happening, you know, this was the rise of democracy and the rise of parliaments. And, you know, people forget, but King Charles I was beheaded in England on the issue of taxes, right? So, and even the French Revolution, a big part of the revolt in the French Revolution was around taxes. And in America, there was this big saying, which is no taxation without representation, which was the moment that led to the American War of Independence and the break away from the colonial system. And the end of that was that those taxes then got to be the fuel for providing mass education, mass healthcare, that translated in welfare states. So, in Pakistan today, you have a taxation level of about 10% of GDP. In any European society that you think of, you have taxation levels of around 40% of GDP, although there's great variation in how much taxes there are. In the US, it's a low tax society, but if you go to Finland, it's a much higher tax society. So in that context, that's the context in which this book situates, of this bigger debate that if you want equity, you want redistribution, you want mass service provision, then you cannot move forward as a society unless we grapple with how to impose and govern taxes. But the book actually also raises a very important paradox when it comes to Pakistan. And I want to kind of shift focus now, Mujtaba, over there, before I come to the central tax the book talks about, which is property taxes. And the paradox that the book talks about is Pakistan has one of the lowest tax to GDP ratios in the world. It's around 10% or about 10%. Actually, paradoxically, how many people here think Bangladesh has a higher tax to GDP ratio than Pakistan? Okay. It actually has a lower tax to GDP ratio, right? But here's the paradox. The paradox is the government expenditure to GDP ratio in Bangladesh is about 7%. The government expenditure to GDP ratio in Pakistan is close to about 16%. So you collect 10% of your GDP in the form of taxes, but you expend 16% of GDP through the public sector. What that means is you're in a state of perpetual deficit and you've incarcerated this country perpetually to a state of debt, right? You just can't get out of that debt. Either we as a society decide we want to go down the Bangladesh route and have a much smaller state, so then society is going to be provisioned by the market and by non-government organizations, or we decide that we want to kind of have a bigger state or sustain the expenditure that the state is doing right now, but then we have to increase taxes either today or in the future. There is no escaping that problem. Now, what I want to come to you is you raise this paradox in your introductory chapter. Obviously, you go then towards property taxes, but why is it we're kind of, this is very schizophrenic. So why is it, Punjabis generally are pretty schizophrenic people, but at a societal level, why is this schizophrenia so ingrained? Why is it that we're not moving either to saying, we want bigger expenditures, so we're going to tax our elites more, our middle classes more, or the other way, which is we say, actually, we're pretty much like the Republicans of America or the conservatives of the UK, and we're going to have a low tax society, but we're going to be for the smaller state. Why is it kind of we're stuck in this halfway house?
So, I think, from what I found reading about property taxes, which is, by the way, a local government tax, so I wasn't looking at, again, the tax issue of Pakistan as such, or macro national federal government taxes, but obviously, that's where it emanates from. I think the history of taxation in Pakistan, and we were just talking about where the British left it.
Yes.
The British left it with a very well-capacitated land revenue system, a very well-capacitated customs system, and a very well-functioning state, right? So, in the 80s, we do away with land revenue. Then, in the 2000s, we do away with wealth tax. In the 80s, again, or 90s, we do away with octroi tax, which was, again, on one pretext or another, not going into why we did away, but we've had a history of doing away with taxes.
Which were land revenue, it was very well established, very substantial tax on production of land, almost a fifth or a fourth of it, of what it produced, that's substantial. Which is replaced eventually by agriculture tax. I think Punjab will be surprised when you say this, but it will pick it with these peanuts. I think what was happening here is either eventually you say taxation is something very contentious. It's not easy to collect taxes. You don't go up to somebody and say, out with your money, and they're going to part with it. Taxation is a very contentious and highly negotiated. It's basically a negotiated settlement between the taxer and the person who is being taxed. And we, for some reason, the state has kind of avoided that. And we can get into the reasons for that. Certain frameworks look at it in terms of, we can say, elected governments. We've had them for half the time that we've, since inception of Pakistan. Very uncertain about the continuity of their rule. So they don't want to get the political hit of imposing tax, and then there's election the next year. So uncertainty about continuity of rule, because if it's going to be a negotiated settlement, then it's your bargaining power as a state or a government against the bargaining power of the people, right? Then half the time we've been under military regimes, inherently insecure, obviously not come through a political mandate, and very concerned about their popularity. So, Zia doing away with land revenue, wealth tax being done away, but wealth tax, it sounds to me a little fishy. Then we talk about the interest groups. Okay? And where's the wealth coming from? And the argument being made at that time, this is Musharraf's time, was that you already pay income tax, and that is how you accumulate wealth, is through your income and over time. So this is like double taxation. But we know a lot of this wealth was coming apart from the income. It was coming as emoluments being made by part of our economy without really working for it. And they didn't want to further pay taxes on it. So our history has been of not just not taking more taxes, but actually doing away with very well-established tax systems and taxes that the British left us with. Now that for me is a very interesting history. There is a point of view again that we have gone down this path because we live in a very interesting part of the world, and we have been driving what they call geostrategic rents. Two Afghan wars, we flushed with cash, flushed with money. A lot of it, by the way, what we call aid was debt, right? But when you have easier sources of money available to you as a government, why would you want to go and negotiate a tax with the citizens who might ask you for something in return?
So that's actually fascinating. So, you're talking about two things. One is you have these geostrategic financing sources coming in, which are cheaper in some sense. And that sort of, in some sense, eases the pressure on you to raise taxes, which is politically costly. On the other hand, you have a constitutional and political system, which is leaving both sides of that equation very uncertain. So again, why would they take or enter into that costly political situation? So that's kind of nice on the political incentive side. What about the expenditure side? What is it in our expenditure that we can't bring it down? Which creates that paradox that I talked about.
If you look at your expenditure profile, you're basically looking at very eminent military overhead. You are a small state with a tax to GDP ratio hovering around 10%, which actually topped at 13% at some point, I think in the 80s, and has been coming down since then. Most of your expenditures are, it's a big country, fifth largest country in the world, 50 million people, growing very rapidly, urbanizing very rapidly. You have a decently sized government, which does give some services. There is not a total absence of services. The
services might not be good at quality, and we can come back to the reasons for that. There is a huge and developing pension liability now, both from the military and the civilian side. And that pension liability could actually topple the equation. It's absolutely huge, and it's going to kick off sometime in 2025 onwards. That's what the actuarial studies, at least in Punjab, said. Just our education workforces, I think, in Punjab is almost 1 million or more. So just imagine the pension liabilities of that. And your military pensions, and then expenditures of running the government, irrespective of its quality. The biggest expenditure now that you increasingly have is your debt repayments. And those debt repayments are eating into, and you'd have the latest figures on that, pretty much the revenue of the government. So very soon, Pakistan would be faced with a situation where its own tax revenues are only clearing the debt repayments, and your expenditures, your development budgets, your current expenditures, pays and salaries, and even your defense might be paid by borrowed money. Now, how attractive would that sound?
So now let's come to the question of property taxes. So these bigger questions Mujtaba takes, but he, in some sense, distills them down to one tax, which is property taxes. I think, like, most people don't think about property taxes at all. It's like, kind of really small,
because they don't
boring.
pay much.
So let's kind of like maybe have a little bit of a conversation about why we should actually think about property taxes as a very fundamental piece of governance and of our delivery systems. Could you kind of elaborate?
Sure. So let me just give you a quick rundown on what the property tax that I wrote this book about, my work has been about, and is the urban immovable property tax. So it's the house tax, basically, or the tax on commercial or private buildings, whatever you have in urban areas. And this is a recurrent tax. This is the annual house tax, that the bill that you get every year. It's globally mostly a local government tax, predominantly belongs to local governments. Even in the British times, this was the house tax that the municipality used to charge, and it is so globally. It pays for local services which are not directly chargeable, like your public services, right? Your payment, the street lights, the water supply, sanitation. In old times, you'd hear that the municipality schools and dispensaries were very good. They were mostly paid for by revenues from this tax. They are direct taxes. That is other issue with Pakistani taxes, which I just referred to and not go into, is our ratio of direct and indirect taxation. Indirect taxation is almost, it's almost half of our total taxation, and that has its own issues. We don't pay much direct taxes, right? Direct taxes are income tax, property tax, your wealth tax, right? These are inherently more progressive. They can be more progressive. So the richer person pays. I'll give you an example, which I do give in my book, is like if you are on your Suzuki 800cc and go to a fuel station to get gas, you might have a Mercedes parked next to you, filling up as well. Now, you in a Suzuki and a Mercedes person would pay the same indirect or sales tax or fuel levy on the liters of petrol that you get. So you hope that he is paying some tax much more than you are because he drives a Mercedes. Now, in Pakistan, that is probably not the case. Okay, so that's our main issue. And that's the difference between direct and indirect. Indirect taxes, by nature, tend to be regressive because pretty much everybody pays the same on the units consumed. Anyway, so property taxes then, by design,
but the way they are, can be hugely progressive. People who have bigger houses pay more taxes, they're local. Um, this expenditure is made locally. So there's a redistributive element to property taxation. People living in the same community or local government jurisdiction, people with big houses pay more tax, and the money is spent within the same local government jurisdiction, and hopefully there would be elements of redistribution within that. So the tax that he pays would provide services to the poor parts of that local government and society. Then it's a tax which you can push a little bit on, and you don't think the house would get up and walk away. The house stays there. So it's an immobile tax base. See, it's houses you can't miss out. There's not something you can hide in Panama, right? So the houses are here. It's relatively easy to calculate this tax. It's difficult to run away. There are issues with collection of the tax that we go into. But this is a relatively easy tax for local governments. Simple tax machine is to collect.
Just to kind of, for the audience to situate it in something, if you look at the development of European nation states, at the eve of the 20th century in about 1910, the tax to GDP ratio in the UK and US was at around 10% of GDP, which is almost the same as what the tax to GDP ratio in Pakistan is today. And actually, per capita income was at fairly similar levels, except the big difference was that in Europe and in the UK, 60% of taxes were collected, 60% in the US and about 40% in the UK came in the form of local taxes like the property tax. Today, at 10% of GDP, Pakistan collects, property taxes in Pakistan constitute about 2%. So our taxation is just completely centralized. Now, what did this taxation do? By the early 20th century, no city in Europe or no city in the US had a problem with clean drinking water. The clean drinking water problem was sorted. Why was it sorted? Because modern sanitation had become a fabric of their cities and their civic lives. And if you take a step before that, you remember, for those of you who read novels of Dickens, about the scholar in London or the scholar in New York had disappeared. And at the root of that transformation was an effective property tax system. And as Mujtaba is saying, local governments basically collected that tax in the form of rates, but they then reciprocated in the form of providing clean drinking water and modern sanitation. And that the biggest mortality drop that human history has seen in these societies came after what is called the municipal transformation of the early 20th century. So Mujtaba's book is, and what Mujtaba is saying right now is that this inability to actually foster property taxes has a flip side, that we are still continuing to struggle with the problem of clean drinking water. Waterborne diseases is something which is having a huge effect, which is biggest manifestation of that is in high rates of stunting. Pakistan has one of the highest rates of stunting in the world for its income level. So these things are in some sense connected, and I think that's why this book is really important. Now, Mujtaba, you kind of like use this word, and it's in some sense the property tax problem mirrors the overall taxation problem. You talk about basically property taxes in Punjab, and you're looking at Punjab, and Punjab has a much better property tax system than other provinces, as being exceptionally low. And you're correct. I mean, I recently did an estimate that Punjab collects roughly about 0.06% of capital value of land as property taxes. India, on average, Indian cities collect about 0.3%. So we're at 0.06%. The average in the developing world is about 0.5. China collects about 1%, and UK and Europe collect around 2%. So that's how exceptionally low property tax collection is. So what I want to kind of now open the door for is, you talk about three big reasons which are not to do with the technocratic debates about policy, that this policy is better, but you talk about fundamental structural factors that are causing this low tax, low provision equilibrium to get sustained.
So, when I was doing this research, what I found, and I was led by the usual problems of property tax globally, right? But what I found was that, some of these problems were just amplified in the case of Punjab. And one of the issues, a major issue, was the fact that, and normally property tax is kind of split between the regional and the local government in terms of collection arrangements and all that. So in Punjab, after the devolution, and the period I was studying was Musharraf's devolution, so the 2000s, when the local governments were really empowered, right? And you'd expect that property tax collection, because their responsibilities had gone up, but the property taxes would also increase because they needed to pay for it. So I found that the post-devolution relationship, as far as tax collection was concerned, became overtly complex. So tax policy was all that is. Tax policy means that the rate at it will be taxed, that the valuation of properties, and exemptions. All these policy matters with the provincial government and the local government. The district was the budgeting authority for the department, which was, and the revenues were going to the Tehsil government. So three tiers were involved. And the Tehsil government had no control over collection or policy of the tax, except expanding the tax base or the area, which would be called urban, and the tax would be levied on that houses in that area. And while responsibility politically lied with the provincial government on tax policy, so that any policy or tax increase that they'll give, they'll get the political hit for that, is in provincial assembly. But 85% of the revenues would be going to the Tehsil government. Now, apart from the political hit and seeing no revenue out of it, there has been, and Ali has written a lot about it, a traditional rivalry between local governments and our first-tier politicians, right? They have never liked local governments for various reasons. They feel there's political competition between local governments and, say, provincial or national government leaders. So they didn't want to see that much money going to the local governments, because the politicians at the local government level might become their competitors in the next provincial or national election, to put it very simply. And so for that and some other reasons, they in fact gave more exemptions in the case of Punjab. This 5 marla exemption was granted during that time, and which knocked off 1/3 of the base of property tax in Punjab. So that was one issue. And the other was basically, and it fits into the issues of taxation in Pakistan generally, is that while, and going back to, you say the services are low, what's the paradox that why more expenditures are not made in delivery of services? And part of the issue is that for most people sitting here, how many public things do you access anyway? Education? Health? No. Water? No. Security? Gated communities, private security guards, right? The only transport? No. The only thing you use for the government is probably the road you travel. So the demand for services of the government, both at the local, provincial, and national level, for people who have political voice is very low. They have probably opted out of the fiscal contract, and they don't want to pay tax because they think then they'll be paying for the services twice, right? And people who need the services don't have the political voice perhaps to translate their need into an effective demand. So, I mean, a lot of these things I do talk about, apart, and a big chunk of my work then talks about, I'm looking at the time also, talks about the actual tax collection department and the issues with that. But those are technical issues, and I wouldn't want to go in there because technical issues is something that development banks advise us on, and they can be overcome.
Yeah.
It's really the will to do it. We've had a number of tax reforms and better tax machineries, better administration, better this and that, but it is not translated into greater tax take for Pakistan because the missing link is that fiscal contract that is not. They were talking about social contract earlier this morning. I hope they mentioned fiscal contract as well.
I don't think so.
So the fiscal contract and the fiscal contract at the local level, when you talk about property tax, is tighter. It's easier to see because you are in your local jurisdiction. You can actually see your money at work. And that is the same for direct taxes. And an indirect tax, when you buy this, you don't know whether you're paying sales tax on services or goods, and which government is it going to? So I'll stop there and
So basically, I think what Mushtaba's book, which he summarized very nicely, raises two or three very fundamental questions of governance for us. So let me talk about the first thing that Mushtaba talked about, which is this problem of the provincial government setting policies on property taxes, but actually the money then going down to local governments to spend, and hence the provincial government has no political incentives. The flip side is that as taxpayers of Lahore, because the property tax is being collected for the city of Lahore, you are paying your tax relationship is being set by the politicians of Punjab. They are not going to be set by the politicians of Lahore, right? Which means that actually the people setting the policy about your taxes are not accountable to you. The only way you can make politicians accountable for property taxes for the city is if you have elected, empowered local governments. And those local governments are empowered to set the tax, and you are empowered to vote them out if you don't like the rates at which they set the tax or what they do with your taxes. But the local government debate in Pakistan is a polemical populist debate. It has transcended into that. There is no discussion of the architecture of fiscal responsibilities and accountabilities that should be in a local government system. So you're all very influential people. I think it is really important to push on that debate. And the second thing that Mushtaba talked about, I find it really, so I did a lot of work, as Mushtaba mentioned, on local government acts around with different governments. I was astonished by one thing, that a public school has not been opened in the city of Lahore in the past 30 years. So effectively, and this is, by the way, not only true of Lahore, it is going to be true of Faisalabad, it is true of Pindi. So effectively, you have privatized your city. So what it means is that actually and what's interesting is that parents today coalesce and fight the government to reduce private school fees, but they will not lobby the government to open a quality public school. I went to Government College Lahore. Central Model School used to be opposite Government College Lahore, and a lot of the base of Government College used to come from Central Model School, which was a government school, and there were many such government schools that provided basically education to the children of Lahore. So the question is, do we want a government which provides these services? Local service like education, sanitation, water supply can only be done if we fix the fiscal contract around property taxes. Shall we open up we have about 10 minutes. If people have, Javed.
Javed Yunus मेरा नाम है जी I'm an economist and I'm a professor and I work on Pakistan for many years, perhaps decades, because Ali Cheema Saab is my friend and guide always, and many others. Okay, so I have two-part questions, sir, if you allow me, because you have done a lot of work and you have written a book on it. One is about local government, And of course, who knows better and more that how local governments work and should work, and what is really the efficacy and efficiency of local government, and what are the effects for our society, more than Dr. Ali Cheema in our country. Obviously, he's a guide to us, and I believe in that. I have read his work. Now, my first question to you is this: that I think first better experiment we did with local government was with the Musharraf government. What is it that prevent us from establishing real local government? Dr. Ali Cheema gave the example of China. Look at China. It's the root cause of its prosperity is based on the local governments. It's not democracy, but it is a democracy at the local government in very effective way. People can vote out their leaders in no time. Here, I just cannot enter the deputy commissioner's office, even as a professor. Second, so what to rule out and root out these people who have no accountability as such, and by whom? Who will make them accountable? Second, question is about the expenditures, Dr. Ali Cheema. I mean, obviously, we are stuck in our GDP tax ratio, and partly the reason is that our GDP is so small. I mean, what will 10% of so small thing do? Our GDP of 240 million people is not even equivalent to the UAE, which is about 10 million people. 80%, 85%, 90% expats. Okay, the question is to you, because you're a senior bureaucrat now, have been, that on the expenditure side, look at the data. I have digged down the data of finance ministries, and we have created 212 SOEs, 85 commercial, 83 subsidiaries of commercial, everyone making collective loss of billions of hundreds of billions every month. Who did that? Second, do you know the manpower ratio from grade 17 to 22 to grade 1 to 16, call the manager to labor. In PIA, it's 1 manager to 2.29 workers. OGDC 1 to 2.59 workers. Steel mill 1 to 2.66 workers. कोई दुनिया की कोई फर्म ऐसा करेगी? मतलब प्राइवेट सेक्टर में कोई बंदा ऐसा कर सकता है? Where is expenditure has gone? We live in villas. Can't we sleep in one canal house in GORs? I mean, where is expenditure going? Who will make? I mean, the list is long. I don't want to go into that because others have questions too. Thank you.
I have just brief question. Is the military economy tax?
Okay, so I give you.
I'll leave the latter question.
I give a brief answer. Yes, if it has to survive, everybody will have to contribute, I guess earlier or later, that realization will come to all stakeholders that you have to contribute productively to the economy. Like you said, it's not only small, it's probably shrinking if it were not for the size or the rate of our multiplication. So, the productive sectors are shrinking. That's why the service sector is expanding so much, because the others are shrinking. Coming to your questions, yes, I mean, the local governments should be there and have to be there if we have to go forward on a number of things. Our local government history has been cyclical, and Ali has written a lot about this, so I won't go into detail. The military governments have brought in local government system for their own reasons. And because they're the ones who brought them in, there was no wider political consensus on that. And then these systems were sort of, put back or just abolished or whatever, mutilated when political elected political governments came in. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. And one of, I think for me, as I understand, the major reason is that it's pushing away the ladder. If you have a good, look at Mustafa Kamal and how he was performing in Karachi. The party had to cut him down, right? He was getting too big. If you perform locally, you will shoot up politically very rapidly. And here we have first-year politicians. We've seen the same faces for the last 30, 40 years. Why? Because we don't have new crops coming in through the local government system, because they shut off the local government system. This crop that we have now, actually most of them came up in the 80s. Local Adil, I think, has written a lot about that. He came up in the local government of the 1980s, but then it got kind of stale after that. So it has to be there. There's no discussion on that, and there are many reasons why it isn't. Your second question, yes, no doubt, the expenditure side of the government has no business to be in non-social sectors. If it has to do anything, it should be primarily in the social sectors. It should not be running an airline. And you didn't give the biggest figure of the airline, where the plane to person ratio in PIA is 400, and the industry normally is 30 to 40 people. And no wonder we're trying to get rid of it. So yes, the government over time has these organizations became or eventually became or were created as because the government became the employer of the last resort. And this feeds into, we didn't go into this big area of patron-client relationships, because that's the whole politics is not around social contract or any issue-based politics, but it is clientistic politics at the constituency level, and giving jobs is the big thing when it comes to that kind of a political dispensation. So there's a reason why they exist, and it's not easy to kill them, but that has to be done somehow.
Thank you, Mujtaba. I'd really urge you, if you haven't read this book, please get it and read it. It's a really important book because it's on such an important issue. But some parts are technocratic, but large parts are very accessible, and I think it develops this kind of bigger sensibility.
One last, sorry to, because I live in GUR, so I must answer this question. After 4 years at LSE, and I came and joined the civil service. It was a career I chose.
Hello.
You see, I could have become a professor. I could have gone into the corporate sector. It is the given set of pay, pensionable job, security of job, and the facilities that the government gives, rightly or wrongly. But that is what people see and make career decisions. You can debate that it should be monetized. I personally am in favor of that. But you cannot blame civil servants for availing what is there. A lot of them don't abuse it, but that is there. When you opt for a career, you do all the pros and cons, right?
You're asking me the question? You asking me the question? You said you asked me the question. No, you chose good. You chose a career. Everybody has a choice to do. And I'm not against civil service or anything like that. I mean, I've got many good friends, and they are very dear ones. The point is not that you look at the GUR 10-acre house and you decide to become a civil servant. That should not be the motive. Second is that it should not be the motive that we look at with few of our policemen, guards who jump out of the car, open our car door, and sadly, that is how the materialistic things are being portrayed by the young bureaucrats on their social media. It should not happen like that, because then that becomes inspiration for them. How about if we sell some acres and increase the pay for the civil servants and pay for their gratuity for their education for their kids and so on, make it more rationalized? Can we do that? For example, let me give you an example. I gave a talk at CSA today, this morning, to the energy syndicates because that's where my work lies. And a gentleman walked to me to the classroom. He's from tax department. He said, I said, okay, do you have any economics or commerce background? He said, no, sir, I have political science background. I said, what are you doing in the tax then? I was just dropped out on this list. मैंने कहा यार ये हम सही नहीं कर सकते मतलब कि एक बंदा जिसने साइकोलॉजी में मास्टर किया है इंग्लिश में किया है क्यों हम उसको पढ़ने में मजबूर करें टैक्स पे हम रैशनलाइज नहीं कर सकते सर छोटी सी चीजें हैं बाकी हम we are at the learning stage we all are
We can take this to the coffee table. I think we have to. Please get this book. Seriously recommended.